The seeds fell into Cecil Sheridan's palm before he even realized he had opened his hand to receive them. He stood at the edge of the Doyle homestead's front porch, hat pressed to his chest out of something that felt half like courtesy and half like grief, watching a woman he had never properly spoken to sort through a small canvas pouch, as though she had all the time in the world and the world owed her nothing. It was the summer of 1878, out on the sun-hammered flats of the Texas Panhandle, where the wind came in long and low off the plains, and the cottonwoods along the creek bent themselves, almost apologetic in its path. Cecil had ridden out to the Doyle place because her neighbor, old Harlan Prout, had asked him to check on her. Harlan's hip had gone bad again, and he could not make the ride himself, and Cecil was the kind of man who said yes to things even when he could not explain afterward why he had. Matilda Doyle was 26 years old, though she looked both younger and older than that depending on what she was doing. When she was working, which was nearly always, the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her hands made her seem like someone who had been managing the world for decades. But when she glanced up and caught you looking, there was something unguarded in her green eyes, something that had not yet hardened into the leathery resignation you saw in most of the women out on the Panhandle. She had come out from Missouri 4 years ago with her husband, Patrick Doyle, who had believed deeply in the promise of West Texas land and had died of a rattlesnake bite in the spring of 1876, leaving her with 47 acres, a stubborn mule named Luther, and a grief so private she had practically built a fence around it. Cecil Sheridan was 31. He had been a cowboy most of his working life, riding for the Carlisle outfit north of Amarillo for the last 6 years, driving cattle up through the Indian Territory and back down again with the seasons, sleeping more nights under open sky than under any roof. He was a lean, quiet man with dark, sun-weathered skin and light gray eyes that had a habit of noticing more than his mouth ever reported. His hair was the color of good saddle leather, and he wore it slightly long at the collar because cutting it always got delayed behind more pressing concerns. He had not, as far as the county was concerned, done anything particularly remarkable. He had not made his fortune. He had not married. He had simply worked and ridden, and kept to himself in the way of a man who had learned that the inside of his own head was sometimes the only reliable place. His mother, Eleanor Sheridan, had died in the winter of 1874, 4 years before this afternoon on Matilda Doyle's porch. Eleanor had been a woman of extraordinary and quiet determination, the kind of woman who could grow things anywhere, who kept a kitchen garden through droughts that killed livestock, who pressed seeds from every plant she ever loved into small paper envelopes she kept in a cedar box on the windowsill. When she was dying, when the consumption had her down to something so slight it seemed like a hard wind might dissolve her entirely, she had pressed a handful of seeds into Cecil's palm and closed his fingers around them with both of her hands. He had not known what they were. He had asked her, and she had only smiled, the way she did when she thought the question answered itself. He had carried those seeds in his saddlebag for 4 years without knowing what to do with them. He had not planted a garden since she died. The thought of it had felt too large, too tender, like pressing on a bruise that had never fully healed. He had almost left them behind in Amarillo. He had told himself a dozen times to give them to someone who would actually use them. But every time he opened that saddlebag, there they were in their small paper envelope, and his hand moved around them rather than to them, and they remained. He had not expected, riding out to check on Matilda Doyle at Harlan Prout's request on a Tuesday afternoon in June, that any of this would matter. He had not expected her to be standing in front of a patch of bare, hard-packed earth beside her front porch with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and an expression on her face that was equal parts determination and something approaching heartbreak. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, because they had been introduced briefly in town, in the way everyone on the Panhandle was introduced briefly in town. "Harlan send you. "Yes, ma'am," Cecil said, swinging down from his horse, a big roan gelding named Compass, and tying him to the porch post. "He's worried about you. His hip's giving him trouble or he'd have come himself." "Harlan worries about everyone," Matilda said, but she said it with a warmth that meant she was glad of it. She was looking back down at the bare patch of earth. "I've been trying to get something to grow here for 2 years," she said, almost to herself. "Patrick used to say this soil was too alkaline. I don't know enough to argue with him about it now." Cecil looked at the patch of ground. It was dry and pale, the color of old ash, and it sat in the angle between the porch and the main wall of the house where it would get morning sun but be sheltered from the worst of the afternoon blaze. It was not, to his eye, hopeless. His mother had grown things in harder soil than this. He did not know why he opened his saddlebag. He did not know why he took out the small paper envelope. He had told himself he was just going to check on her, ask if she needed anything hauled or repaired, and ride back to the Carlisle outfit before dark. But his hands were already moving, and Matilda Doyle had turned to look at him with those clear green eyes, and before he had fully decided anything, he was holding out the envelope. "I don't know what all of these are," he said, which was the truth. "But my mother, she knew what she was doing with seeds. She never grew a thing that didn't thrive." Matilda looked at the envelope for a moment. She did not reach for it immediately, which he noticed. She was the kind of woman who thought before she accepted things. "Your mother," she said carefully, "is she nearby?" "She passed," Cecil said, 4 years ago." Something moved across Matilda's face, not pity exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one grieving person encountering another. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the way that people mean it when they actually know what loss feels like. "She'd have wanted them used," Cecil said, and that was the truest thing he had said about it to anyone. Matilda reached out and took the envelope from his hand. Her fingers were calloused and warm, and she held the envelope the way a person holds something they have decided to be careful with. She opened it gently and tipped a few seeds into her own palm, studying them with an attention that made Cecil feel, strangely, like he had been seen. "These are squash," she said, turning a few of the larger seeds. "And these smaller ones, I think these might be wild bergamot. My grandmother grew wild bergamot." She paused. "These darker ones I'm not sure of." "She grew sunflowers," Cecil said, because he remembered that much. "And herbs, she grew everything." Matilda looked up at him then, and the afternoon light caught her face in a way that made the sadness there plainly visible and also the strength. "Would you like to help me plant them?" she asked. "I know you've ridden out here on an errand, not a social call. But I could use another pair of hands and—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I think they ought to be planted by someone who knew the woman who kept them." Cecil stood there for a moment with his hat still pressed to his chest, and he thought about the Carlisle outfit and the work waiting for him there. And then he thought about his mother's hands closing around his fingers in that cold bedroom in the winter of 1874, and he said, "All right." That afternoon, they worked side by side in the pale, alkaline soil, and Matilda was not wrong that she knew things about gardening he did not. She knew about amending soil, about mixing in the ash from the wood stove and some of the darker earth from down near the creek, hauling it up in a bucket. Cecil did most of the hauling because Luther the mule had decided that afternoon was for standing in the shade and not for being cooperative, and Cecil found he did not mind. There was something almost medicinal about the physical work, about kneeling in the dirt beside this quiet, competent woman and pressing seeds into the earth his mother had chosen without knowing she was choosing it. They did not talk much while they worked, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the easy silence of two people who are both accustomed to their own company and do not feel the need to fill the air. When they did speak, it was practically about the depth of the rows, about the spacing, about whether the porch overhang would give too much shade. When the planting was done, Matilda stood and pressed her hands against the small of her back and looked at the turned soil with a complicated expression that Cecil recognized as the particular satisfaction of having done something that might still fail. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it, for the seeds and for staying." "I'll tell Harlan you're doing all right," Cecil said, gathering himself to leave. "Tell him I said to rest that hip," Matilda said. He rode back to the Carlisle outfit in the long amber light of early evening, and he thought about her the whole way, which surprised him. He thought about the way she had opened that envelope with such careful attention. He thought about the patch of turned earth and whether the seeds would take in that pale alkaline soil. He thought about his mother, which he usually tried not to do because the grief had a way of sitting on his chest like a stone when he let it, but thinking about her tonight felt different. It felt less like pressing on a bruise. It felt like something was loosening. He did not go back to the Doyle homestead for 2 weeks, and he told himself that was appropriate. He had done what he was asked. He had checked on her. He had helped with the garden. There was no reason to go back unless Harlan sent him again. Then a summer storm rolled through the Panhandle with the particular violence that Panhandle storms had, all lightning and horizontal rain and wind that knocked the henhouse wall off the Carlisle place and sent the cattle skittering to the south fence, and Cecil spent 3 days helping sort out the damage. On the 4th day, with the sky washed clean and the land steaming in the renewed heat, he found himself thinking about that small patch of soil beside Matilda's porch and whether the rain had done damage or good. He told himself he was riding in the direction of town anyway. He told himself it was not out of his way. He turned compass down the rutted track toward the Doyle homestead and told himself he was just checking. She was in the garden when he arrived. Of course she was. She was crouched over the small patch with her hair in a loose braid that had come half undone in the heat, and she was so focused on what she was doing that she did not hear Compass's hooves until Cecil was nearly at the fence. She looked up, and for just a moment before she composed herself, he saw a kind of uncomplicated gladness on her face that made his heart do something complicated in his chest. "Mr. Sheridan," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. "Mrs. Doyle," he said. "I was riding past." He looked at the garden and was genuinely arrested. "They came up," he said, and he heard the roughness in his own voice and hoped she did not. They had in fact come up. There were small green shoots in 2 of the rows, bright and determined in the early morning sun, pushing through the amended soil with that particular insistence that new growing things had, that sense of arrival. 3 days ago, Matilda said, and she was smiling. It was the first time he had seen her really smile, and it rearranged something in his understanding of her face. "I did not expect it so quickly. I thought with the alkaline soil, but they came through the storm and here they are." "My mother would have said the storm helped," Cecil said, dismounting and coming to the fence. "She said plants need to be challenged sometimes, that the easy growing is not always the best." "That sounds like something a woman of sense would say," Matilda said. She was looking at him steadily. "I've been thinking about her, about the fact that she kept these seeds all her life and then gave them to you and you kept them all those years. That's a particular kind of faithfulness." Cecil was quiet for a moment. "I didn't always know why I kept them," he said honestly. "I almost left them behind more than once." "But you didn't," Matilda said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." She invited him in for coffee, which was an offer he accepted. Her house was small and scrupulously clean, with a few things that spoke of Missouri and of before. A quilt on the back of the rocking chair that had a pattern he recognized as a certain kind of East Coast handiwork. A small framed watercolor of the kind of green rolling countryside that Texas absolutely was not. 2 books on the shelf beside the stove that were worn with real use. She made the coffee in a battered tin pot and poured it into proper cups, which he noted. "You've made a good place here," he said, meaning it. "I've made a functional place," she said, sitting across the kitchen table from him. "Good is something I'm still working toward." "Is there a difference?" She considered this seriously. "Functional is a house that doesn't fall down and land that produces enough to live on. Good is a house that feels like it belongs to you, where you chose everything in it because you wanted it, not because it was there when you arrived or because your husband picked it." She paused. "That sounds ungrateful." "It doesn't," Cecil said. "It sounds honest." She looked at him with that measuring quality she had, the one that made him feel like she was determining whether he was worth trusting. "Patrick was a good man," she said. "I want to be clear about that. He was kind and he worked hard and he believed in this land when no one else I knew did, but the house was his vision, not mine. And now it's just mine and I'm still figuring out what I'd do differently." "What would you do differently?" Cecil asked because he was genuinely curious. She smiled slightly. "More windows on the south side and a porch swing." And she paused, looking a little self-conscious. "I'd plant a garden the day I arrived, not wait 2 years. They talked for an hour that morning. They talked about Missouri, which she had left at 22 with a husband and a full wagon of hope, and about the Texas Panhandle, which had beaten some of that hope flat and refined the rest into something harder and more useful. They talked about the cattle business and about the drought cycles that everyone on the plains was learning to fear and plan around, and about old Harlan Pruitt, who had apparently once been a cavalry officer and whose hip injury was, according to local consensus, a result of his own stubbornness. They talked about things that did not matter and some things that did, and when Cecil finally rose to leave, he was aware that he had stayed longer than was proper for a casual visit, and that he did not regret it. "I'll ride past again," he said at the door, settling his hat. "If you're riding past," she said, in a tone that suggested she knew he had not actually been riding past the first time but was choosing to find it charming rather than concerning. He rode back to the Carlisle outfit feeling something he had not felt in a long time, something that was inconvenient and warm, and entirely outside his ability to reason away. Over the following weeks, Cecil Sheridan found reasons to ride past the Doyle homestead with a frequency that he knew perfectly well was not coincidental, and which he suspected she knew was not coincidental either. He helped her patch the roof where the storm had pulled back a shingle. He helped her convince Luther the mule to accept a new harness. He brought her a bag of cornmeal from the trading post in Clarendon that she had mentioned she was running low on, which he told himself was simply being a neighbor, even though he was not technically her neighbor, living as he did in the bunkhouse at the Carlisle outfit 10 miles north. She, for her part, always had coffee ready when he arrived, which he thought was probably not coincidental either. She fed him twice, once a proper supper of beans and cornbread, and once a midday meal of cold chicken and biscuits that he ate sitting on her porch steps in the shade, and she did not seem to be doing it out of obligation, which was the only kind of feeding he would have been comfortable accepting. The garden grew. This was the thing that kept drawing him back with a sincerity he could not entirely attribute to Matilda, though she was most of it. The small patch of soil beside her porch put out more green every week, and by late July it had become a genuine garden, fragrant with wild bergamot that turned out to be a deep purple that Matilda said was the most beautiful color she had seen in West Texas, and heavy with the broad leaves of what was indeed turning out to be a generous squash, and lined at the border with the tall, determined stalks of sunflowers that had come up in the back row of the darker seeds and were heading now toward a height that was going to overtop the porch rail. Cecil watched the sunflowers grow and thought about his mother with an ache that was different from the ache he had lived with for 4 years. It was still sadness, but it was sadness with something good mixed into it, something that felt almost like gratitude. He began to understand, in a way he could not have before this summer, why she had pressed those seeds into his hand, not because she expected him to plant them, not because she had some specific plan for them, but because she had wanted to give him something that carried her forward into his life after she was gone, something living, something that required care and attention and returned in kind. He had not understood that until he saw those first green shoots breaking the pale soil on a July morning beside Matilda Doyle's porch. One evening in early August, he came by in the late afternoon, which was later than was strictly proper for a man and an unmarried woman, and they sat on the porch as the sun went down behind the distant mesa, and Matilda poured whiskey from a bottle she produced from inside with a slightly defiant look, as though expecting him to comment on it. He did not comment on it. He accepted the cup and they sat together in the long copper light and watched the sunflowers move slightly in the evening breeze, and after a while Matilda said, "Cecil," not Mr. Sheridan, just Cecil, which she had not done before. He looked at her. "I think you should know," she said carefully, "that I am not in the habit of inviting men to sit on my porch and drink whiskey with me." "I know that," he said. "I am also not in the habit of thinking about someone for 4 days between visits and then feeling relieved when they appear at the fence," she said, with the directness that he had come to understand was simply how she was, not cold but clear. He was quiet for a moment. The evening light turned the garden gold. "I rode out here the second time on a pretext," he said. "I told myself I was riding past. I was not riding past." "I know that too," she said. "I don't have a great deal to offer," he said, because he was the kind of man who thought honesty up front was better than honesty later. "I work for wages. I have a horse and a good saddle and some money saved, but not enough to—" He paused. "I've been thinking about getting my own land, but thinking and having are different things." "I know the difference between thinking and having," Matilda said dryly. "I've been living on the narrower end of both for 2 years. I just want you to know I'm not coming around because it's easy or convenient," Cecil said. "I'm coming around because I'd like to keep coming around if you'll let me, and I thought you deserved to know that plainly." Matilda looked at him for a long moment. The whiskey sat untouched in both their cups. The sunflowers tilted slightly in the evening wind, their great heads already heavy with the promise of seed. "I think I would like that," she said, plainly. He reached across the porch and covered her hand with his, and they stayed that way for a while as the light faded and the first stars appeared above the flat line of the Panhandle horizon, and it was the most settled Cecil Sheridan had felt in years. But the Panhandle was not in the business of letting things be simple, and the summer of 1878 had more to say before it was done. The trouble came from the direction of a man named Virgil Cate, who was not a villain in the operatic sense, but was the kind of ordinary greedy man who causes plenty of damage without any dramatic flair to account for it. Cate ran a cattle operation to the east of the Doyle place and had been pressuring Matilda for the better part of a year to sell her 47 acres to him, primarily because her creek access was better than his, and the drought had made water rights into the most valuable currency on the Panhandle. He had offered her a fair price the first time, which she had declined. He had offered her a less fair price the second time, which she had also declined. By August, when Cecil had taken to being a regular presence at the Doyle homestead, Cate was moving into the territory of thinly veiled hostility, letting his cattle push through her fence line, which he always claimed was an accident, and once making a point of stopping on the road outside her property and watching her work for an uncomfortable length of time without dismounting or speaking. Cecil had not been present for any of these incidents, but he had heard about them, because the Panhandle was not large, and its population was not given to keeping things quiet. He heard about the fence damage from Harlan Prout, who had heard about it from the postmaster in Clarendon, and he heard about the road incident from Matilda herself, who mentioned it with a controlled tone that he had learned meant she was angry but was not going to give it more weight than it deserved. "Has he threatened you directly?" Cecil asked. "Not in words," Matilda said. "He's the kind of man who thinks presence is the same as threat. He's probably right." "You could go to the sheriff," Cecil said. "The sheriff in Clarendon is not interested in a woman's boundary disputes with a man who runs 300 head of cattle," Matilda said flatly. "That's not cynicism, that's just the county." She was not wrong, and he knew it, and the knowledge sat badly with him. The injustice of it was plain and ordinary and familiar. A woman alone, land she had worked hard for and earned the right to keep, and a system that ran quietly in the direction of men with money and cattle. He had seen it before, and it had never stopped irritating him in the way that things irritate you when you can see clearly that they are wrong but cannot fix the structure that makes them so. What he could do, and did, was make his presence at the Doyle homestead consistent enough that Kate could not pretend not to notice it. He was not heavy-handed about it, did not take to standing in the yard with his arms crossed or making any kind of show. But he was there, regularly and visibly, and the Panhandle grapevine being what it was, Virgil Kate knew within a week that Matilda Doyle had someone in her corner. The fence incident stopped. Kate's cattle found other directions to drift. It was not a permanent solution, and Cecil knew it, but it bought time. What the fence incidents and Kate's pressure did accomplish, unintentionally, was to speed up the conversation that Cecil and Matilda had been having obliquely for weeks and bring it into sharper focus. Because one evening in late August, sitting on the porch after a supper she had made and he had helped clean up after, which felt thoroughly domestic in a way neither of them commented on, Matilda said, "I have been thinking about the land." Cecil waited. "I could sell," she said. "Kate's original offer was fair. I could take it and go back to Missouri or go somewhere new. That is one option, and I want to acknowledge it's an option because I think sometimes we create unnecessary suffering by refusing to see our choices clearly." "That's true," Cecil said. "But I do not want to sell," she said. "I want to keep this land, and I want to build something on it that Patrick started but did not finish, and I want to do it because it is mine and because I have earned it, and because the garden is growing and I am not leaving while the garden is growing." Cecil felt something warm move through his chest. "All right," he said. "But I cannot do it entirely alone forever," she said, and she was looking at him steadily. "I've been doing it alone for 2 years and I can keep doing it, but it is harder than it needs to be and I know it. And I think you know it too." "I do know it," he said. "So I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly and not based on what you think is expected." "Go on," he said. "Is what is happening between us something you intend to see through?" she asked. "Because I have enjoyed your company greatly and I find that she paused, and a rare color came into her face. "I find that I have feelings I did not expect to have again, and I would rather know now than later whether you are the kind of man who has them back." Cecil was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he wanted to answer her the way she deserved to be answered, with the full weight of honesty and not just the easy reassurance. "I am the kind of man who has them back," he said, "and yes, I intend to see it through if you will have me." She looked at him for a long moment. The night was coming on and the oil lamp through the window was the only warm light on the porch. "I thought that was what you were going to say," she said, "but I needed to hear it." "I know," he said. "I'm glad you asked." He kissed her that night for the first time, standing at the porch rail with the garden below them. And it was not a dramatic or sweeping kiss but a careful one, the kind that acknowledges weight and consequence and means to be honest about both. She kissed him back with exactly the same quality of care, and they stood together in the warm August dark for a while after, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, listening to the nightjars calling across the flat. September came in with a break in the heat, which was almost startling after the long fire of the summer, and the change in the air seemed to change the pace of everything. Cecil had a conversation with Tom Carlyle, who ran the outfit, about his future plans. Carlyle was a practical man, and he had seen this coming. He had watched Cecil leave for the Doyle homestead often enough to put it together, and he was decent about it. He told Cecil that if he wanted to leave and set himself up on his own land, the time was good, and that there would always be seasonal work if he needed it in the lean years. Cecil had been putting away wages for 6 years. He had not spent money freely, having no particular reason to, and the amount he had saved was not large by any cattle baron's measure, but was enough for a start. He had been watching the land around the Doyle homestead with the eye of a man who has begun to make plans, and there was a section to the north of Matilda's property, adjacent to her land, and also with creek access, that had come available after the family that had been working. It gave up and went back to Kansas. He rode to Clarendon and talked to the land agent there, a man named Fitch who smelled of pipe tobacco and was more honest than his profession usually produced, and he found the numbers workable. He told Matilda about it on a Sunday in late September when the garden was full and fragrant and the sunflowers had turned their great heavy heads toward the south and were beginning to dry, their seeds fat and ready. "You're buying the Hester section," she said, using the name of the family who had left. "If you have no objection to me as a neighbor," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Is that what you're proposing, to be my neighbor?" "I'm proposing a good deal more than that," he said quietly. "But I thought the land question should come first so you'd know I had a plan and not just intentions." "What is the good deal more?" she said, and she was looking at him with that clear, steady gaze that he had come to understand was her truest expression, not challenging, but simply unwilling to accept imprecision when precision was possible. Cecil took off his hat. He was not a man given to long speeches, and he did not make one. "I would like to marry you, Matilda," he said. "I would like to buy the Hester section and combine it with your land and build something together that belongs to both of us. I would like to keep coming to supper, and I would like to stop having to ride back to the Carlisle bunkhouse afterward. And I would like to plant the rest of my life in the same place you plant yours." She was quiet for a long moment. The garden rustled slightly in the September wind. One of the sunflowers dropped its head a little further as though it were listening. "That last part," she said, and her voice was slightly unsteady in a way he had not heard before, "about planting your life." "Yes," he said. "That is the right thing to say," she told him. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "That is absolutely a yes." They were married in November of 1878 in the small Methodist church in Clarendon, which held 20 people if they were willing to stand close. And they were married on a Saturday so that Harlan Prout could attend, Harlan having made it extremely clear that if they married on any other day of the week, he could not promise his behavior regarding the matter. Harlan came with his hip aching and his best hat and a gift of a cast iron pot that was, he claimed, the finest cast iron pot available in the Texas Panhandle, and Matilda accepted it with the seriousness it deserved. The ceremony was brief and practical, as befitted both their characters and the time of year. The minister, a serious young man from Ohio, who had come west with the earnest intention of doing good and had not yet been entirely worn down by the reality of the Panhandle, read from Scripture and said words about love and partnership that were somewhat formal but not entirely untrue, and Cecil said his vows looking directly at Matilda, who said hers looking directly back at him, and neither of them looked away. Afterward, the gathered friends and neighbors went back to the Doyle homestead, which was theirs now together, and ate the food that had been organized by the women of the settlement. A potluck of the particular frontier variety, which involved a lot of dried and preserved things done with significant skill, and one genuine cake that Mrs. Harlan Prout had managed by a feat of baking that impressed everyone and which she would not explain. They drank cider, and a little of the whiskey Matilda had brought out from her private supply, and people said warm things and made a noise that filled the small house in a way that drove back a lot of its silence. Cecil stood at the edge of the room and watched his wife, a word that sat in his chest with a weight that was entirely welcome, move through her own gathering with the ease of a woman who had learned to manage things. And he thought about the afternoon in June when he had ridden out here at Harlan Prout's request and had ended up on his knees in the dirt planting seeds he had carried for 4 years. He thought about his mother. He thought about those small green shoots breaking through pale alkaline soil on a July morning. He thought about the way Matilda had taken the envelope from his hand and opened it with such care, as though she knew it was worth being careful with. He was not, by nature, a man given to dramatic internal speeches, but he thought, as he stood there in the warm noise of his wedding party, "Cecil Sheridan, you knew what you were doing." The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a good winter, by which the Panhandle measured good winters cold but not catastrophically so, with enough snow to hold moisture in the ground without the blizzard conditions that could take cattle. Cecil spent much of it doing the unglamorous work of establishing himself on the combined land, repairing fences, improving the barn, getting his own small cattle herd started with 12 head he purchased from the Carlisle outfit at a friendly price. Matilda spent it managing the house with the focused energy she brought to all practical things, and also with a new quality in her movements that Cecil noticed in the mornings, a thoughtfulness, a care with her own body that made him watchful. In January, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, standing at the stove with her back to him, and then she turned around and looked at him with an expression that was careful and wondering and slightly braced, as though she expected complicated feelings from him. The feelings were not complicated. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and said, "That is the best news I have ever had." And she let out a breath that she had apparently been holding for some time and then laughed, which was a sound he had been collecting since summer. "I wasn't certain how you would take it," she said, "given that we have only been married 2 months. "I am taking it extremely well," he said. "The baby came in August of 1879 on a hot Tuesday with the assistance of Mrs. Harlan Prout and a competent midwife from Clarendon named Hannah Rays, who had seen more births on the Panhandle than anyone, and whose calm authority was the most reassuring thing Cecil had ever encountered. He was not in the room, this being 1879 and such things being arranged as they were arranged, but he was on the porch, which was where Harlan Prout also stationed himself, and they sat together through the long hours in the way of men who are performing the particular function of being present and useless, which both of them understood was still better than being absent. The baby was a boy. He came in at what Mrs. Prout judged to be a healthy size, with a head of dark hair and an opinion about the world that he expressed immediately and at volume. Cecil was allowed in after the midwife had done what needed doing, and he stood at the edge of the bed and looked at Matilda, who was exhausted in a way that was also incandescent, and at the small, indignant person in her arms, and he felt something shift in him that he knew was permanent. "He looks angry," he said. He was comfortable where he was, Matilda said, not without sympathy for the baby's position. "What do you want to call him?" They had discussed names but not settled on any. Cecil looked at his son and thought about the summer and the garden and the seeds and the woman in the bed who had handed all of that back to him by simply receiving what he had offered. "Robert," he said, "after no one in particular, just because it suits him." "Robert Sheridan," Matilda said, trying it. The baby had settled somewhat and was investigating his fingers with the intense concentration of the newly arrived. "Yes, I think that does suit him." They had Harlan Prout in to meet Robert the following morning, and Harlan, who was not a sentimental man by reputation, held the baby with a careful expertise that spoke of having done this before and said, looking at Cecil, "Your mother would have liked this." Cecil nodded. He could not speak for a moment. "She was a woman who understood that things go on," Harlan said, who had known Eleanor Sheridan briefly in the way that everyone in a sparse settlement knows one another. She would have appreciated the going on of this. The years that followed were not without hardship, because the Texas Panhandle was not in the business of providing years without hardship, but they were good years in the ways that mattered and hard in the ways that could be endured. The cattle business had its rhythms of drought and plenty, and Cecil learned them the way you learned everything on the plains, by surviving the bad seasons and noting what worked. He hired 2 hands by 1881, men from down in the Edwards Plateau who were good with cattle and quiet in the way of experienced ranch workers, and the operation slowly expanded to a scale that provided real stability. Matilda's garden, which had started with a handful of her dead mother-in-law's seeds in pale alkaline soil, had by 1881 become a substantial kitchen garden that took up most of the south side of the house and produced through the growing season with a reliability that made the neighbors take notice. She had amended the soil each year, adding to it and learning from it, and the garden had responded to her attention the way growing things respond to someone who is paying true attention. The wild bergamot came back every year, self-seeded and spreading, and its purple was still the best color on the Panhandle in Matilda's considered opinion. The sunflowers she harvested their seeds from that first September and replanted every spring, a chain of continuation that she was precise and deliberate about. She saved them in a cedar box she had bought in Clarendon, which she kept on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. The cedar box was not identical to Cecil Sheridan's cedar box, but it served the same purpose. And Matilda knew this, and Cecil knew this, and neither of them found it necessary to say so. The question of Virgil Kate resolved itself in the way that some problems resolve, not through confrontation, but through changed circumstances. Kate's water problem was eventually addressed when he dug a second well on his own property in 1880, which reduced his interest in Matilda's creek access to approximately nothing. He was civil when their paths crossed in Clarendon, which was not often, and whatever simmering resentment he had carried about her refusal to sell, he had apparently decided to direct elsewhere. Cecil watched this development with quiet satisfaction and said nothing about it, because there was nothing that needed saying. Harlan Pruitt's hip finally gave out entirely in the winter of 1881, and after a difficult few months, he moved from his own place into a room in the Sheridan house, which was by then large enough to accommodate him, because Cecil had built an addition onto the east side in the spring of 1880. Harlan was not easy to live with in the conventional sense. He had opinions about everything and a volume level that suggested he had spent too many years around cavalry orders. But he was devoted to Robert, who was 2.5 and had his mother's green eyes and his father's tendency to notice things, and who followed Harlan around with the fearless trust of a child who has identified a grandfather-shaped person in the vicinity. Watching Harlan with Robert was one of the things that went into Cecil's private accounting of what was good about his life, a list that he did not keep literally, but that he reviewed sometimes in the early mornings before anyone else was awake, sitting on the porch with his coffee in the growing light. Matilda, the land, the cattle doing well, Robert's dark hair and opinion. Harlan's voice carrying from the back of the house where he was explaining something about horses to a 2-year-old who was listening with grave attention. The garden, dormant in winter but present, shaped by all the work that had gone into it, waiting for spring. In the spring of 1882, Matilda announced that she was expecting again. She told him in the garden this time, where she was doing the first turning of the soil, and she said it straightforwardly because by now straightforward was simply their language with each other. When? He asked. October, I think, she said. He came over to where she was standing and put his arm around her, and they stood there in the early spring, looking at the turned soil together. What do you want this time? He asked. Healthy, she said immediately. After healthy, he said. She leaned against him slightly. I would like a daughter, she said, but I won't be disappointed either way. I know you won't, he said. The second child arrived in October as predicted, in the same room with the same midwife, Hannah Rays, who had become something approaching a friend in the years between. It was another boy, larger than Robert had been and quieter about it, arriving with a sort of calm deliberateness that made everyone in the room exhale with a kind of wondering gratitude. They named him Thomas, and Matilda accepted the result of not getting a daughter with the grace she applied to most things, genuinely, without performance. Healthy, Cecil reminded her. Absolutely healthy, she agreed, looking at Thomas with an expression of full and uncomplicated love. I stand by my priorities. Robert, who was 3, received the news of his brother with a guarded interest that slowly resolved into protectiveness, once Thomas became large enough to be interesting. By the winter of 1882, Robert had appointed himself a kind of advisor and guide to the new arrival, a role he took with complete seriousness. Harlan Pruitt held Thomas and declared him a fine specimen, and went back to teaching Robert about horses with minimal interruption to his schedule. The years moved through the early 1880s with the texture of real life, not smooth, not simple but full. Cecil worked the land with the attention it required, and sometimes more, learning the rhythms of West Texas ranching through experience and through the counsel of men who had been at it longer. There were the lean years and the better years, and there was always work, but work on your own land for your own future had a quality entirely different from working for wages, and Cecil had known from his first month on the property that this was the kind of life he had been reaching toward without quite being able to name it. Matilda, meanwhile, had discovered in herself a practical knowledge of the land that surprised even her. She had taken a keen interest in the water management question that was the perennial anxiety of Panhandle ranchers, and had corresponded with, and then met in person at a county gathering in Amarillo, a rancher from down near the Caprock named Eleonora Vasquez, who had developed a system of shallow earthworks for capturing rain runoff that was, according to Eleonora, responsible for keeping her cattle alive through the drought of 1880. Matilda had come home from Amarillo with a head full of plans and a friendship with Eleonora that lasted the rest of their lives, and over the course of the following 2 years had implemented a modified version of the Vasquez water capture system on the Sheridan property, which Cecil had watched with an admiration he expressed by doing whatever she told him to do without asking questions. "You've thought about this more than I have," he said one afternoon in 1883, watching her drive stakes to mark the line of a new earthwork. "I've thought about it as much as you have," she said, "but in a different direction." "That seems like the right division of labor," he said. She looked at him with a smile that was both fond and slightly teasing. "Cecil Sheridan, you are the most even-tempered person I have ever met." "Is that a complaint?" he asked. "No," she said. "It is one of the reasons I love you." He caught her around the waist then, stake driving be damned, and she laughed her real laugh, the one that was fuller and less composed than her public one. And Robert, who was 4 and had come out to watch the stake driving with authoritative interest, said "Papa," in a tone of profound disapproval of the interruption to the work. 1983 brought a visit from Matilda's younger sister, Clara, who had been living in St. Louis and had written the year before asking if she might come west to see how her sister had settled herself. Clara Doyle was 23, unmarried, with a quick intelligence and an overwhelming impression of Missouri that hit the Panhandle like a weather event. She stayed 2 weeks and spent most of them asking pointed questions about everything: the cattle, the garden, the water management system, the social arrangements of the Panhandle, and the character of everyone she met, and then declared that she might return permanently because St. Louis was, in her opinion, less interesting than she had previously believed. Cecil watched Clara and thought that she was very like Matilda in her directness, but with less of Matilda's patience, which made her both exhausting and very entertaining. He also watched her meet one of his ranch hands, a young man named Miguel Garza from down near the Caprock, who was 25, serious, excellent with cattle, and apparently entirely unprepared for Clara Doyle. The watching of this development occupied Cecil and Matilda through 2 evenings on the porch after the boys were in bed, speaking in low voices, and with the particular enjoyment of 2 people who are secure enough in their own happiness to enjoy watching it begin in others. Clara went back to St. Louis but returned the following spring as she had promised, with 2 trunks and a letter of introduction from a judge's wife in Missouri who apparently believed Clara needed the endorsement. She did not end up needing it. She was Clara Doyle, and she needed no introduction to anything. She found a small place to rent in Clarendon and took work helping the postmaster with his accounts, which he was apparently terrible at, and she and Miguel Garza were married in 1885, which made them neighbors of the Sheridan operation in a way that pleased everyone, including Harlan Pruitt, who had by then claimed authority over all romantic developments in the settlement by virtue of age and conviction. The spring of 1884 brought what Matilda had asked for. She had told Cecil in the fall that she thought she was expecting again, and this time she said 3 would be enough. in a tone that suggested she was stating a preference rather than issuing a complaint, and he had agreed that 3 was a fine number and privately thought that whatever she decided was fine by him. The baby came in May, when the garden was already running with color. It was a girl. She came in the same way Thomas had, quiet and deliberate, as though she had thought it through, and when Matilda held her and Cecil sat beside her on the bed and they looked at their daughter together, there was a long, wordless moment that contained a great deal. "Eleanor," Matilda said, and Cecil looked at her. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice did the thing it sometimes still did when he thought about his mother, that roughness that he had stopped being embarrassed about. "You're certain?" "I've been certain for months," Matilda said. "I kept it in reserve in case it was another boy." "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said. A mother's intuition about these things should not be entirely dismissed. He took Eleanor's hand, which was the size of a moth, and her fingers closed around his with the automatic grip of the newly born, and he thought, "Eleanor Sheridan, who pressed seeds into my palm and died in the winter and sent me out into the world carrying them. Eleanor Sheridan, who knew that gardens were a form of hope, and that hope required placing it in the care of someone who would carry it forward." He thought, "Here she is." Harlan Prout, who was 81 and moving slowly but had declined to do anything as inconsiderate as dying, held Eleanor in the careful way he had held Robert and Thomas, and this time he did not say anything. He looked at Cecil, and his eyes were bright, and he just nodded, once deeply, and that was the whole of it. The naming of Eleanor was the kind of thing that the settlement remembered. People who heard about it understood it without explanation, in the way that people who live close to the earth understand that things come back around, that seeds planted in grief can come up in love, that the dead do not entirely leave but travel forward with us in the things they gave us while they were here. In the summer of 1884, with Eleanor 2 months old in the garden at its fullest, and the cattle operation running well enough that Cecil had hired a third hand and was considering a further land purchase to the east, Cecil and Matilda sat on the porch one Sunday evening, Robert now 5 and Thomas nearly 2, and Eleanor sleeping inside. And the garden below them was purple with wild bergamot, and the sunflowers were at their full height, and the whole south side of the house smelled of growing things. And Matilda said, "Do you remember the first time you came here?" "Clearly," Cecil said. "You handed me that envelope," she said, "and I remember thinking, this man is carrying something he doesn't know what to do with." "That was accurate," he said. "I didn't know if it was just the seeds," she said, "but I think I suspected it was more." "It was grief," he said honestly. 4 years of not knowing what to do with my mother being gone." Matilda nodded. "Grief takes up residence and rearranges the furniture, and eventually you have to decide whether you're going to let it keep the house or just give it a room." "You gave it a room," he said. "Patrick's room," she said quietly. "He has a room. He is not the whole house. He never should have been the whole house even when he was alive, but grief," she paused, "grief is not proportionate, you know that." "I know that," he said, "but it can be proportionate eventually," she said, "if you let it." He reached over and took her hand. They sat that way as the evening came on, and the garden filled with the cooling air and the first night insects beginning their work, and the Panhandle sky went through its colors the way it did, the orange deepening to copper, deepening to that particular shade of dark red that appeared only just before full dark on clear evenings, a color so specific to this country that he had begun to think of it as belonging to the place the way the wind did, essential and unrepeatable. "I didn't know why I took those seeds from her," Cecil said after a while. "When she gave them to me, I didn't understand what she was doing." "What do you think she was doing?" Matilda asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I think she was making sure I didn't stop," he said slowly, "that I didn't close up, that I kept reaching toward things, even after." Matilda was quiet, listening. "She knew I'd be a man who could close up," he said. "She knew that about me. And she gave me something alive and told me to keep it without telling me why, and as long as I kept it, I was keeping some part of myself open without knowing I was doing it." "And then you gave it to me," Matilda said. "I didn't plan to," he said. "I still don't entirely know why I did." "I do," she said, and she turned to look at him. "You recognized someone who needed them." He looked at her. "I was closing up too," she said. "Not as thoroughly as you might have, because I'm less suited to it by nature. But I was making the land and the house into the whole of my life, because grief had convinced me that was all there was going to be. And then you came riding up with those seeds, and you were so clearly trying to do something right without knowing what it was. And I thought," she smiled, a small smile that was equal parts fondness and wonder. "I thought, this man has something he has been carrying for a long time that belongs somewhere." "Here," Cecil said. "Here," she agreed. "It belonged here." The sunflowers above the porch rail tilted slightly in the evening breeze, heavy-headed and gold, dropping the slow accumulation of their seeds into the turned earth below with a patience that required nothing of anyone, only the willingness to plant again next spring. Robert appeared in the doorway behind them, backlit by the lamp, his dark hair rumpled and his expression the expression of a 5-year-old who has been in bed and has become bored with the arrangement. "Papa," he said, "I can't sleep." "Come here then," Cecil said, and Robert came out onto the porch and climbed into his father's lap with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has always been told he is welcome, and Cecil wrapped an arm around him, and Robert looked at the garden with the frank appreciation of a child who has grown up with it. "The sunflowers are very big," Robert observed. "They are," Matilda agreed. "Are they from great-grandmother's seeds?" Robert asked, because this was a thing they had told him. "Some of them are," Cecil said. "The rest come from those first ones. They seed themselves and come back." Robert considered this. "So they keep coming back even after the first ones are gone?" "Yes," Cecil said. "Oh," Robert said, with the satisfied tone of a child who has received an answer that makes sense to him. "That is good." "Yes," Cecil said, "that is good." They sat there, the three of them, as the stars came out over the Panhandle in the particular thick abundance they had at this latitude, far from any city and its competing light, and the garden below them rustled, and the cattle made their distant sounds from the north pasture, and the whole of the Texas Panhandle at night was full of its own large silence that was not really silence at all, but was instead composed of 10,000 small sounds that added up to something that, if you had lived with it long enough, sounded like home. Thomas, inside, began to stir, and Matilda rose to see to him, pressing her hand briefly on Cecil's shoulder as she passed, the small familiar touch of two people who have been sharing space and care and wait for years, and have found that the small gestures say as much as the large ones. Cecil sat on the porch with Robert drowsing against his chest, looking at the garden and the stars, and he thought about the distance between the man he had been in June of 1878, riding out to check on a widow at a neighbor's request, carrying 4 years of unplanted grief in his saddlebag, and the man he was now. He thought about how the distance was traversable only in retrospect, how at the time each step had felt small or accidental or uncertain, and how from here they assembled into something that was clearly and obviously the right path, even though at the time none of it had been obvious. He thought about his mother's hands closing his fingers around those seeds. He thought about Matilda's hands opening that envelope with such careful attention. He thought about the seeds going into the pale earth and the first green shoots coming up through the storm. He thought, this is what she meant. Not the seeds specifically, not even the garden specifically, but the willingness to receive something and carry it and bring it somewhere and put it in the earth and wait. The willingness to not close up. The willingness to let something live. Robert shifted in his arms and made the small sound of deep childish sleep, and Cecil held him and thought, Cecil Sheridan, you would have been an extraordinary grandmother. He said it quietly to the night and the stars and the garden did not answer, but the wild bergamot moved slightly in the cool air, and the sunflowers stood in their tall, patient row, and the Panhandle went on being the Panhandle, vast and specific in theirs. Inside, Cecil was crying the small cry of a hungry baby, and Matilda was speaking to Thomas, who had woken fully and wanted to know what was happening, and Cecil could hear the low, warm music of her voice through the open window, patient and clear, telling Thomas that his sister was hungry and everyone was fine and it was time to go back to sleep. He thought, I should go in. He sat a moment longer first. He wanted to hold this, the sleeping weight of his son against his chest, and the garden breathing below him, and the stars overhead, and his wife's voice through the window doing the patient necessary work of love, and all of it here, all of it planted and growing and rooted in this piece of Panhandle earth that had been his mother's seeds and a widow's determination, and a cowboy's stubborn refusal to throw away what had been placed in his hand. He rose carefully, carrying Robert, and went inside. The years that followed 1884 were years of building and deepening, the slow accretion of a life that knows itself. Cecil expanded the cattle operation by gradual and careful degrees, never stretching further than he could manage, and by 1887, the Sheridan Ranch was a recognized name in the Armstrong County area. Not the largest operation, but one of the most consistent, with a reputation for quality cattle and a water management system that other ranchers came to look at. Matilda received credit for the water system with a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that was neither falsely modest nor self-important, which was simply her way. Eleanor Vasquez, who had become Matilda's closest friend through their correspondence and their shared interest in the practical science of dryland agriculture, visited twice, and the two women spent long hours in the garden and over the kitchen table with diagrams and notes, an intellectual partnership that Cecil found enormously satisfying to watch. Two competent women doing the work of figuring things out, the particular pleasure of watching minds engage. Robert started school in Clarendon in 1886, riding in with the Garza children. Clara and Miguel had two of their own by then, on the school days, which were 3 per week. He was a good student with a particular aptitude for numbers that his teacher mentioned to Matilda with genuine pleasure. Thomas was watching the school question from a distance of 3 years, with the air of someone building his argument against the injustice of having to wait. Eleanor, the youngest, was a child who defied easy description. She had her mother's directness and her father's noticing quality, which in combination produced a person who at 2½ was already precise and observant, and had strong opinions about the correct placement of everything in her vicinity. She had also taken an early and absolute interest in the garden, which delighted Matilda, and which Cecil watched with a feeling that he could not have named without reaching for something that was not quite language. Because Eleanor, at 2½, had discovered the cedar box on the windowsill. She could not reach it herself and required assistance, which she requested by standing at the kitchen counter and pointing at it with absolute conviction until someone understood. She had Cecil lift it down for her one afternoon while Matilda was out at the water earthworks, and she had opened it the way her mother opened things, carefully, with full attention, and she had looked at the envelopes of saved seeds inside with an expression of recognition that had no business being on the face of a 2-year-old, and yet was entirely and clearly there. Cecil crouched beside her and watched her small fingers touch the paper envelopes. "Seeds," he said. "Seeds," she agreed gravely. "Your great-grandmother gave me some of those," he said, "a long time ago." Eleanor looked at him with her mother's green eyes. "Where did she go?" She asked because she was at the age of large questions asked without preamble. "She died," Cecil said, "before you were born, before your brothers were born." "But the seeds stayed," Eleanor said. He looked at her. She was looking at the cedar box with complete calm, turning one of the paper envelopes between her fingers. "Yes," he said, "the seeds stayed." "Good," said Eleanor Sheridan, at 2½ years old, and set the envelope back in the cedar box with care. Cecil sat in the kitchen for a long time after she had wandered off to find the cat, which was a substantial tabby named Governor, who ruled the south side of the house with a disinterest in human opinion that the entire family found endearing. He sat with the cedar box in front of him, and the afternoon light coming through the south-facing windows that Matilda had always wanted, windows that he had put in during the 1880 edition, and he thought about chains of things, about how one thing leads to another thing leads to another thing in ways that are invisible until you look back, and then suddenly clear. He thought about his mother, dying with that calm that he had never quite stopped marveling at, the calm of a woman who had understood something he was still learning. He thought about the seeds in his saddlebag for 4 years, crossing the Indian Territory and back with him, riding through Panhandle storms, surviving every circumstance that might have lost them. He thought about Matilda's porch and the pale alkaline soil and the first green shoots breaking through after a summer storm. He thought about Eleanor, his daughter, who was named for a woman she would never meet but who had already, at 2.5, grasped the essential point about the seeds. He closed the cedar box and put it back on the windowsill. That evening, when Matilda came in from the earthworks and washed her hands and turned to him with the particular look she always had when she suspected he was sitting with something, he told her about Eleanor and the cedar box and what she had said, but the seeds stayed. Matilda was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down across from him and said, "Of course she said that." "Is it strange," he asked, "that she understood it?" "Children understand more than we give them credit for," Matilda said, "and she is her father's daughter in that." "How do you mean?" he asked. "You understood the seeds too," Matilda said. "You just did not understand that you understood them. She is a little more straightforward about it." Cecil laughed, which was a thing he did more easily than he had 10 years ago. "Is that a compliment or a comment on my capacity for self-knowledge?" "Both," Matilda said cheerfully. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture he had made on the porch in August of 1878, and had made many hundreds of times since and still found had not diminished in any quality through repetition. "Matilda," he said. "Cecil," she said. "Thank you for taking the seeds," he said. She looked at him, that clear, steady, unguarded look she had, the one that had rearranged his understanding of her face the first time she really smiled, and had not stopped doing so since. "Thank you for bringing them," she said. They were still sitting that way, hands together across the kitchen table with the cedar box on the windowsill above them, and the garden full, and the evening coming on, and the children variously occupied with the business of being children, when Harlan Prout appeared in the doorway from the back of the house with Robert behind him, and a look of authority that meant he had thoughts about what should happen next. "Supper," Harlan said in the tone of a man who has waited long enough. "Working on it," Matilda said without moving. "You're sitting," Harlan observed. "I am allowed to sit in my own kitchen, Harlan," she said. "I didn't say you weren't," he said. "I said supper." Cecil rose to help. He was the kind of man who helped with supper, which Harlan had commented on favorably exactly once, in the tone of a man admitting something he had not expected to admit, and which had not been mentioned again, but which both of them understood represented a significant endorsement. Matilda rose also, and they worked together in the kitchen, as they had worked together in everything, with the easy coordination of two people who know where the other will be before they turn around. Robert helped by being a serious and literal assistant who passed things when asked. Thomas helped by sitting on the counter and providing commentary that was occasionally useful. Eleanor appeared from wherever she had been with the governor and sat on the floor with the cat and discussed the day's events with him in low and serious tones. Harlan sat at the table and contributed opinions. The lamp came on as the light went outside, and the kitchen was warm with the heat of the stove and the noise of a family at the end of a day, and outside the garden was going to dark in the cooling evening, and the Panhandle stars were beginning above the flat edge of the world. This was the life that had come from a handful of seeds pressed into a grieving cowboy's palm in the winter of 1874 by a woman who loved him and knew what she was doing even if he did not. This was what she had seen when she had closed his fingers around them and smiled with the peace of someone who has arranged things as well as they can be arranged and is ready to go. She had seen or hoped or known in the way that people who pay close attention sometimes know what they cannot prove, that those seeds would find their ground, that he would find someone who would receive them, that the garden would be planted, and that when it was planted it would be more than a garden. The seeds had stayed. The garden had grown. The love had come up through the hard soil like those first green shoots, tentative and then certain, fragrant and purple and gold, rooted now deeply enough to hold through any weather the Panhandle could produce. Cecil Sheridan, who had not planted a garden since his mother died, who had carried 4 years of unplanted grief in his saddlebag across 1,000 miles of country, who had ridden out one June afternoon in 1878 on a neighbor's errand, and had found at a widow's fence a woman standing in front of bare earth with her sleeves rolled up and seeds in her hand. Cecil Sheridan had planted his garden, and it had come up beautifully. And it went on coming up, year after year after year, in the amber light of the Texas Panhandle, tended by 2 pairs of hands and then 5, growing through drought and storm and change, persistent as wild bergamot, tall as sunflowers following the light, carrying forward the seeds of what had been left behind into everything that was still to come.